Did the person of Jesus exist historically? Did he really rise from the dead? Here is one of the claims made just a few weeks after Jesus' death by one of his closest followers, Peter. Peter states, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it." This part of Peter's speech is recorded for us in Acts chapter 2 of the Christian New Testament. What Peter is claiming on this day is central to the Christian faith, that the man Jesus lived, died, and was resurrected. But what of this claim? Is there any historical evidence for this claim? For we need to establish whether or not Jesus actually existed and died, for if he didn't exist nor die, then the claim to resurrection is invalid. In this series of 3 videos, I would like to try and present the historical evidence that requires an explanation. Christians over the years have believed that this evidence demonstrates that the best explanation is that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. So I would ask that you consider the evidence. And all of us ought to keep considering the evidence placed before us. Not just accept it on blind faith, or because someone up the front perhaps tells you that it's true. Christian or non-Christian, skeptic or believer, can I encourage you to check out the evidence yourself? If you're a skeptic, then I'm really glad that you're watching. Can I encourage you to be asking yourself as we go through, is what is being presented plausible? Might this be true? Today I want to ask you to consider the evidence. I'm not asking you to suspend anything. I'm not asking you to put your scientific brain to one side. I'm simply saying, might what we see be plausible? Anthony Flew, the famous English atheist, stated that his philosophical position was to follow the evidence where it led him. If you're an atheist or a skeptic, will you do likewise and follow the evidence where it leads you? To begin, how is it that we know things? Well, there are, broadly speaking, 5 different ways in which we acquire knowledge. The first type of knowledge is scientific knowledge. Now, we acquire this type of knowledge through applying the scientific method, which functions under 2 main premises. Firstly, that actions are observable, and secondly, that there is a constancy to actions and that they are repeatable. In this case, the scientific method does have some constraints, but please don't hear this as a weakness. In fact, it's one of its great strengths. However, the scientific method is not the only way we acquire knowledge, although these days the notion of scientism is often presumed or sometimes proposed as the only way in which you can know things. But we acquire knowledge by a number of other means. Now, the second way in which we acquire knowledge, or the second type of knowledge that we can acquire, is what's known as rational knowledge. It's that form of knowledge which is derived from a system where the rules themselves provide consistency and dictate certain outcomes. An example of rational knowledge would be that particular knowledge derived from mathematical proofs. If you're trying to prove something mathematically, you're not using the scientific method. You're applying a system of mathematical knowledge and proofs. Again, this method has some constraints, but also great strengths when used accordingly. The third way in which we acquire knowledge, and the third type of knowledge, is historical knowledge. It's that form of knowledge that's derived from events that have taken place in the past. In much the same way that you use the scientific method to derive scientific knowledge, we use the historical method to derive historical knowledge. We'll say more about the historical method shortly. The fourth type of knowledge that we can acquire is what's known as knowledge derived from subjective inquiry, sometimes known as our experience. We often derive this knowledge from a large number of experiences. It can be a significant way in which we know things about our world and the way in which we know ourselves. For example, that we know that we love somebody. This form of knowledge is a valid form of knowledge, but can often be very subjective. that I feel something is true, but what that feeling means may sometimes be more difficult to articulate or understand. The final form of derived knowledge is that of revelation. It's a form of knowing or coming to understand things that cannot be derived from the other four sources. For example, my middle name. I think it's worth knowing. I think it's a valid form of knowledge. But how would you acquire that piece of information? The manner through which you would acquire it is because I would need to reveal it to you. Now, you still here need to trust whether or not the source of that knowledge is trustworthy and reliable, so you can't use the scientific method, nor can you use the historical method. That particular type of knowledge about revelation is that which needs to be revealed to you. When it comes to the historical claims of resurrection, we can't actually prove, in the theoretical and arguably the only sense, that Jesus rose from the dead. The only knowledge that proves anything is actually rational knowledge. You can't even prove scientific knowledge. You can, under the scientific method, produce a hypothesis and test it, but technically you can't prove it. So in this particular series of videos, I want to try and show the reliability of the historical evidence that we have for 5 key areas concerning the person of Jesus. Firstly, did he live and die? Secondly, was he buried? Thirdly, what of the claim to the empty tomb? Fourthly, what are we to make of the claim to resurrection? And fifthly, how do we explain the changed attitude of the disciples? What is the likelihood that Jesus existed historically? For if he didn't exist, then he couldn't have died. To start with, it's worth saying that historians are not really sure what Jesus looked like. Here's some images of the way in which Jesus has often been portrayed. In what you might call a traditional portrayal, perhaps a youthful Jesus, a Hollywood Jesus, the blue eyes and blonde hair, and a Middle Eastern understanding of Jesus. At best, we might assume that Jesus from appearance was a Middle Eastern Jew, so he probably wasn't fair-skinned, nor did he have blonde hair. So what is it that we know about Jesus? Well, there are 2 broad areas of evidence that historians use. The first is known as external evidence, those historical documents that are external to the claims of Christianity. These include Greco-Roman and Jewish sources. And the second is internal evidence, particularly the writings of Christians about the person of Jesus. We have before us a number of what we would call external sources from Greco-Roman history. Many of these you can look up for yourself and actually go and check. These 2 in particular are written about 70 years after Jesus died. The first one by Pliny, who was a Roman lawyer and magistrate, and wrote many letters, which have also been found. Here, writing in 112 AD, he writes, "They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a god." Secondly, this particular quote from Tacitus, who was considered to be one of Rome's greatest historians. Writing in 115 AD, Tacitus writes this: "Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." Notice what Pliny and Tacitus both mention. They mention this figure called Christ, but in reality, they don't really say very much. Well, here then is another of our external sources written closer to the time of Jesus, about 20 years closer to his death, than the Greco-Roman sources. The 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, who lived between 37 and 100 AD, became a Roman citizen and was employed actually as a historian for emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. He mentions Jesus and his brother James in his historical writings. Now, Josephus was not particularly favourably disposed towards early Christians, so it's recognised that he writes with some bias. He writes here in AD 95. Some of the historians doubt the contents of this full quote that Josephus writes, for some argue that Christians have, since its original writing, embellished or added to it within a couple of hundred years of the original sources. So here let's take out the debated references, and now let's have another look at the quote. This is what Josephus says, taking out the disputed parts of the reference. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of surprising deeds, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. See, even when we strip it back to what the majority of historians agree was the original quote, Josephus still sheds light on this historical figure called Jesus. Now, when we start to compile what we know from the Greco-Roman, Jewish, and other external sources, as the three quotes we've looked at and some other sources by Thallus in Julius Africanus, the letter to Marabar Serapion, and Lucian of Samosa, we can establish the following summary about the person of Jesus, drawing on the external records that we've got. We see that a man named Jesus lived in Palestine around 26 to 36 AD. He has a family, a mother Mary and a brother James. He was a noted teacher and miracle worker. Some thought him to be a king. He was executed on a cross under Pontius Pilate, and both Jewish and Roman leaders were involved in his death. Unexplainable and strange things happen at the time of his death, and Christians continue to worship him after his death. Before opening the pages of the Bible to consider the historical claims made in it, having considered the external evidence, we can establish that Jesus existed and was killed on a cross under Pontius Pilate, and the majority of historians would agree with this. So today, if you're someone who is somewhat sceptical about the existence of the person of Jesus, why not consider the evidence that's been presented before you? Consider if the claims for the existence and death of Jesus are supported by the historical evidence at hand. And as you consider this evidence, will you follow where it leads you? Will you consider then that the claims made about Jesus not only have a firm historical grounding, but also that they will have a claim on how you understand the world and the life that you live? In our first video, we considered how it is that we derive knowledge, and considered that historical knowledge is derived differently from other forms of knowledge, such as, say, scientific knowledge. Secondly, we also considered some historical evidence from external sources for the life and death of the person of Jesus. From these Greco-Roman Jewish sources and others, we can conclude the following. We can conclude that on good historical evidence, that a man named Jesus lived in Palestine around 26 to 36 AD. He has a family. His mother's name is Mary and his brother's name is James. He was a noted teacher and miracle worker. Some thought him to be a king. He was executed on a cross under Pontius Pilate. Both Jewish and Roman leaders were involved in his death. It's recorded that unexplainable and strange things happened at the time of his death, and the Christians continue to worship him after his death. And as we saw, all of this was before we even opened the pages of the Bible. In this video, we will observe how some methodological considerations for the study of history are important, as well as consider the historical reliability of the New Testament documents. Are they actually reliable? We will conclude by considering the historical claim to both the burial of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb. There are 4 considerations regarding the methodology for studying history. The first thing to realise here, or the first consideration, is that the study of history is different to the study of the discipline of science. The study of history, as we've heard earlier, seeks to determine what has taken place in the past. In contrast to, say, the study of science, which makes a presumption that the observation is able to be repeated and that the thing that's being observed can actually be observed. The question, therefore, that needs to be asked is it possible to determine, and how can we actually determine what has taken place in the past? One of the key distinctives of the historical method is that it interrogates the historical sources. So much so that in doing so, we need to recognise that not all sources may have been preserved, and might not have always been preserved perfectly. Sometimes we have incomplete sources for things that have taken place in the past. The second consideration with regard to studying history is that of objectivity. Some today may argue that we can never really know what actually took place in the past, because each person has their own opinion of it. Well, granted, that rarely is a historical event recorded or retold without a subjective aspect or bias. However, does this mean that the event did not take place? Nor that the fundamentals of the event cannot be determined? Now, as to why the event occurred and what meaning the event carried, sure, some of these things may well have a greater subjective flavour. The third methodological consideration is the distinction between historical and theological reliability. What I'm seeking to do here is to consider the historicity of Jesus and how this can be assessed and determined. At this stage, we're not talking or considering about the validity of the claims that Jesus makes with regard to a theological point of view. We're simply trying to determine whether or not the claims about Jesus are historically accurate. The fourth consideration is seeking to determine historical reliability. In seeking to determine historical reliability, there are a number of criteria that are to be considered. After Dixon's consideration, we say that many of these may be used together. I list some of them here and provide an explanation. Firstly, that idea of multiple attestation. When historians seek to build up a picture of what took place, they seek to sort out what are the sources and how many there are. The more independent the source, the more confident that we can be about reconstructing what took place. This particular criteria affirms that when a number of independent sources offer the same, or very, very similar recounting of an event, that it is most likely that that event took place as it was recorded. Secondly, the criteria of coherence. The plausibility of an event is partly determined by whether or not it is consistent with what we already know and what we already expect to take place. Thirdly, the criteria of dissimilarity. When something that is recorded is so unlike other statements, for example, a saying of the day, then this makes it more likely that it actually took place. It is much less likely, for example, that the saying was invented much later on after the fact. So, for example, when a deed or saying of Jesus can be shown not to have derived from Judaism nor from the early church, we may be quite confident that the gospel writer did not invent it. Fourthly, the criteria of archaic style. Many of the New Testament Gospels were written in Greek, but many of the day spoke in Aramaic. Thus, those parts of the text that we have recorded for us that display a strong Aramaic style, are generally regarded as older, recorded closer to the event. Fifthly, the criteria of embarrassment. Things that would have been an embarrassment to those recording the event are given great weight. For example, if you were making up an event, you'd probably want it to look good. One example of this is the women as eyewitnesses in the gospel. For in some cases, women's testimony had little weight. Therefore, why use their testimony unless that is what had actually taken place? Sixthly, the criteria of memorability. Those sayings that are recorded for us that are more memorable are more likely to have been passed on by Jesus' followers. Seventh, the criteria of date. Episodes contained in earlier sources are often considered to be more reliable. For the less time that took place between when the event took place and when the event was recorded provides less time and less opportunity for that event to have been embellished. So what of the reliability of the New Testament documents? How reliable might those documents be? Can they be trusted as a reliable historical source? Some questions that need to be asked, or we need to seek answers to, include, after Paul Barnett's questioning, how reliable are these New Testament documents? How close to the time of Jesus were they written? Can we accept biased reports? Were the writers eyewitnesses to the actual events? And how do we know that what was originally written is what we have today? As we consider the New Testament documents, We need to realise that one of the fundamental differences between our culture today and that of the early first century is that theirs was predominantly a culture of oral tradition. They learnt by speaking and hearing, not by reading. Some historians estimate that only about 10 to 15% of people could actually read in the first century. This verbal tradition was therefore in place both for the process and content of the transmission of information and knowledge. When many couldn't read, the most trusted means of preservation of knowledge was through an oral tradition. As such, we should expect that this is part of the inquiry that we undertake. In the first century, the word disciple, the key term for the follower of Jesus in the New Testament, literally means learner, a commitment to not just following, but more importantly, studying the words and deeds of the one being followed. What this means is that the tradition of Jesus was preserved. Compare two similar passages of a story about Jesus in two of the Gospels. Yes, there will be minor variations, but both tell the story of the same event. Oral tradition may forget or remove some small details. However, what we find is that the key central elements of the narrative are well preserved in the historical record. Secondly, what we notice here is that what we now call the New Testament was originally 27 scrolls of varying length and by multiple authors. I've listed here the scrolls by author. You'll notice here some of the authors make multiple contributions to the historical record. Now, we know that most of these authors wrote independently of each other, so this fulfills the criteria of multiple attestation. Multiple independent authors writing about the same events, and each of their work was circulating separately until about the 2nd century, when their various works started to be compiled and collected. As these letters were collected, they formed a canon or a rule, based often on the church leaders or apostolic authority. We will say more in the next video about the nature of the early writers being eyewitnesses and then recording what they've seen and heard. In our previous video, we considered the historical evidence for the life and death of the person of Jesus. Now we turn to the second of our considerations. Was the body of Jesus actually buried? See, if the body was just disposed of, then of course when you went to the tomb, it would not have been there. We first need to establish that the body was placed in a tomb. So what evidence do we have that the body of Jesus was actually placed in the tomb, as Christians would claim? There are a number of pieces of evidence that we can use to consider. Firstly, all 4 gospel accounts in the New Testament provide a consistent account for the burial of Jesus. This is clear in all 4 independent sources. Now, granted that Matthew and Luke may have used an earlier independent historical source, nevertheless, we still have 3 consistent sources. Secondly, it's recorded for us that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish ruling council, as we read in Luke's account, requests the body of Jesus. Now, the ruling council was strongly opposed to Jesus, so this was unlikely to be a later invention of the Christians, for it would have been very embarrassing to them if they had have put this in, contrary to what may have actually been taking place. Thirdly, we have no other competing burial story. Within the historical accounts, there are no other possible alternative accounts for where Jesus was buried. For example, as we read through the accounts, it's not as if there is a contention as to which tomb he would have been placed in, and as readers today, we have to try and pick the best one. Fourthly, we see Jesus' followers actually follow the body from the place of crucifixion to the place of burial. This is not a word of mouth thing, which would have made it very difficult for someone to go and find the body in the dark on that first Sunday. Not surprisingly, it is the women who go and follow the body from crucifixion to burial to ensure that they know where the body has been laid, because their plans are on the following Sunday to go and prepare the body for burial. There is reasonable evidence that upon the death of Jesus, his body was removed from the place of crucifixion and then buried in a known tomb. So what then of the empty tomb? The following Sunday after crucifixion, the historical sources recount for us that the tomb was empty. What evidence do we have for this? And what is the likelihood that the evidence shows us this? Firstly, Mark's Gospel account records for us an empty tomb, and the account is simple and lacks embellishment. To give an illustration of this, here on the screen I've drawn from the Gospel account of Peter, which he describes the empty tomb. Notice what we're told. The cross appears and starts talking. Now, what is the likelihood of that actually having taken place historically? The Gospel of Peter is not as trusted a historical source for various reasons, and particularly because it is somewhat difficult to verify its historicity. It does not appear to be embellished, whereas Mark's account does not appear to be embellished from earlier accounts. Mark's account seems somewhat plain, almost, dare we say, factual. Those sources that lack embellishment are often considered to be more reliable, because it wasn't uncommon for some narratives to be embellished over time to make the story sound more believable, or perhaps more impressive. Mark's account of the empty tomb lacks embellishment. The second piece of evidence we have for the empty tomb is that it was first discovered empty by women. Now, some Christians have argued that this uses the historical criterion of embarrassment that we saw earlier. The argument for this runs that if there are things in your account that are embarrassing, then you're more likely to be reliable, because if you're trying to make yourself look better, you might try and somewhat clean up the account and maybe not include those things that you thought would be embarrassing. Others would suggest that the testimony of women was not valid. Others suggest that the testimony of women was not valid, but just not used as frequently. Whether or not here it was a criteria of embarrassment or not, the account of the women discovering the empty tomb is still an important one. Why is it that the account records that the women found the tomb? Well, when we read the account, it has the hallmark of fulfilling the role that the women had intended. The women's intent was that they would go back on the Sunday to put spices on the body, which is why they were careful to notice where the body had been laid. The account would then seem unusual or strange if it had the male disciples discovering the body first. The question a historical reader would ask was, weren't the women planning on going as was their custom and practice? That the tomb is discovered by women is important and shows a high likelihood that the tomb was discovered empty. Thirdly, what of the appearance of the grave clothes? It's recorded for us that the body is lifted up through the long piece of cloth. Again, the record that the body is no longer present is testified to by the eyewitness account that the cloths in which the body was wrapped were still residing in the tomb as if the body had simply been removed from them. Fourthly, with regard to evidence for the empty tomb. In Matthew chapter 28, the Jewish allegation is that the disciples have stolen the body. See, now if you propose that the body has been stolen, then you're not arguing that the tomb is empty. Arguably, the ones who killed Jesus or put Jesus to death, arguably, they are the ones who first recognise an empty tomb. And the reason that they give is the theft of the body. Justin Martyr, an early Christian writer in 150 AD, writes that this account was still being circulated by the Jews of the day as the reason for the empty tomb. See, even at that latter stage of history, there was no dispute that the tomb was empty, just that the disciples had moved the body. What of the fifth piece of evidence that the tomb was empty? Well, within several weeks, there is an early public declaration of the empty tomb. As part of Luke's historical account in Acts chapter 2, Peter claims publicly that the empty tomb is on display. And he does this by making reference to the tomb of David, the bones of their ancestors who still would have been in his tomb. Peter says to his hearers, "The tomb of Jesus is empty. If you like, go and see for yourself." These 5 considerations all point to a high likelihood that the tomb was empty on that very first Easter Sunday. So far, we have considered the historical evidence for the life and death of Jesus by crucifixion, the burial of Jesus, and the claim by eyewitnesses that the same tomb was empty that first Easter Sunday. We've seen that there is good, reliable historical evidence for these claims. But as compelling as this is, they are somewhat overshadowed by the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus and the changed behaviour of the first followers of Jesus. And it is to these which we will turn in our next video. In our first two videos, we considered the historical evidence for the life and death of the person of Jesus. We considered both external and internal sources, and so far we can conclude the following: that a man named Jesus lived in Palestine around 26 to 36 AD, that he has a family, that he was a noted teacher and miracle worker, that some thought that he was a king, that he was executed on a cross under Pontius Pilate, and both Jewish and Roman leaders were involved in his death. It's recorded that unexplainable or strange things happened at the time of his death, and that the Christians continue to worship him well after his death. We also know that upon Jesus' death, his body was taken off the cross and placed in a known tomb. The following Sunday, the tomb was discovered empty by women. And even the Jewish authorities of the day spoke of an empty tomb. We have seen that there is good, reliable historical evidence for all of these claims. But as compelling as this is, these claims are overshadowed by the post-resurrection appearances of the man Jesus and the changed behaviour of his first followers. What then of the eyewitness accounts? Well, one of the key features of the gospel narratives is that they draw on accounts from people who walked with Jesus, who spoke with him, who lived with him, and who were present with him in daily life. Luke, the historian, in his opening chapter, records this for us. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." Luke here recognises in his opening statement of his gospel account that he is not an eyewitness personally. But notice what he records for us. He has carefully sought to compile from those who were eyewitnesses what has actually taken place. And the outcome of his writing is that he wants those who are reading it to have certainty, to have surety about the things that actually took place. Similarly, when Luke recounts events in his second volume, what's listed for us in the Christian Bible as the Book of Acts, his articulation of detail indicates a strong knowledge of the time of the incidents being written about. It has details that could not have been included if the account was written much later by another author. Luke's writings, both his Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, are considered by many historians as a very reliable historical source for events taking place in the first century, both among those who may have faith and those who have none. So, how early were the Gospel accounts written? Many of the accounts about Jesus were written within 40 to 60 years after his life. This means that the earliest accounts could have been verified by others as they were reading them, or hearing about them. Of particular note are the writings of Paul, which were written as early as about 15 to 20 years after the death of Jesus. It's also worth noting at this point that the Bible, while it looks like one particular book, is actually a series of independent works that have been compiled together. There are about 25 different pieces of writing in circulation by about 100 AD, and this body of work about Jesus continues to be circulating. It was in circulation within 30 to 60 years of the death of Jesus, so it could be verified by people who were still alive. By way of comparison, with regard to other historical figures, the earliest recorded writings we have for some of them are hundreds of years after their death. The historical writings about Jesus are recorded by eyewitnesses and are recorded close to his life. This adds to the high likelihood that they are an accurate recording of the life and work of the person of Jesus. For some other historical figures, note Alexander the Great. The earliest recording we have about his life is written 450 years after his death. Even the earliest biography of Muhammad that we have is dated to be 125 years after his death. Finally, what can we say about the early tradition that the Christians have started circulating being passed on? Well, one of the things that we see in one of Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians is that Paul writes this of Jesus in chapter 15. He says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Paul had clearly received this early creedal statement about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that was already in circulation in the early 50s, some 15 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. This is another key feature of the early church. They are keen to copy and preserve accounts of the life of Jesus, both in an oral form and also in a written form. This means that when it comes to written forms, there are many copies in circulation, which also enables the record to be well preserved in the historical record. The New Testament Gospels are historical sources. As such, many historians, both those who are Christians and not Christians, when considering the Gospel as historical documents, find them to be reliable, historically accurate, valid sources. As John Warwick Montgomery says, "To express skepticism concerning the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of the ancient period are as well attested biographically as is the New Testament." We have considered the historical evidence for the life, death, burial, and the empty tomb of Jesus, but what of the eyewitness claims of the post-resurrection appearances? What is it that Jesus looked like in the post-resurrection appearances? What does the historical record tell us? On a number of different occasions to different groups of people, the man Jesus appeared in physical resurrected bodily form. That he appeared to a number of different groups of people at a number of different times lessens the likelihood of a consistent hallucination, either a mass hallucination or the same hallucination to different people. So how then is it that Jesus appears? The accounts indicate that he appears in bodily form, that he is recognisable as the person of Jesus. People do not need to ask him who he is. They recognise him. That Jesus talks and relates to those whom he did prior to his death. That he eats with them. And also that we see he appears to the following people and following groups of people. To the Apostle Peter, to his 12 followers, to many women in the location of Galilee, up to 500 people at one time, and to the man Saul. Here, notice that the sources for this evidence is from multiple independent authors. See, if all the resurrection appearances had been from the one historical source, this would lessen the likelihood that it actually took place and could be true. But at this point, we do well to ask, but what were the disciples expecting? Maybe they saw what they had hoped for. The disciples had hoped that Jesus would come back from the dead, and so maybe they just saw him back from the dead. However, at this point, consider the position that they were in. Their leader had just been killed. They were afraid, frightened in fear of the Jewish leaders who might be coming after them to arrest them and put them to death by the Romans. Also, their expectations had remained unfulfilled in three main ways. Firstly, if they thought that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, then he was a dismal failure. For the Jewish Messiah, many thought, would come and kick out the Roman rulers. Jesus didn't do this. Secondly, if the disciples thought he was going to be a king, then his death on a cross meant he was considered a criminal and not a king. Thirdly, the commonly held Jewish belief of the afterlife, that great day of resurrection, was that all would come back from the dead, not just one man. And yet the disciples claim that at that point only Jesus has been resurrected. So much so that when the disciples stand up and claim that the man Jesus has been resurrected, they are actually going against all the commonly held beliefs and understandings of the Jewish Messiah. What they are speaking of is very different from the Jewish expectation of the time. Consider now the behaviour of the early disciples. What else could explain the historically recorded behaviour of those early disciples? For many of the disciples who claimed to be eyewitnesses, they were more than willing to suffer and die horribly for that claim that Jesus has risen from the dead. This is so completely inconsistent with the story of a group of scared fishermen hiding from the Jewish authorities on Easter Saturday. Would they all have been prepared to suffer ridicule, hatred, being social and religious outcasts, and ultimately being put to death? If they'd agreed together and taken the body, hidden it, and then made up this idea of resurrection? Consider also the historical accounts of the expansion of the follower of Jesus. This group of early eyewitnesses speak of the resurrected Jesus and start proclaiming it to others. As a result, many become convinced. They too become followers of Jesus, and the number of disciples grows rapidly and significantly. What else could explain this, other than the compelling historical evidence that many at that age could have gone and investigated for themselves, firsthand? They could have visited the empty tomb. They could have talked with the eyewitnesses. They could have investigated the evidence. Why do so many become followers of Jesus? What has the strongest explanatory power for the evidence that we have? Well, you might have thought that the friends of Jesus were far more likely to believe in the resurrection of him. But what of one of Jesus' worst enemies, the man known as Saul or Paul? Consistent with his personal witness and testimony, Paul recounts his conversion experience in seeing the risen Jesus in physical bodily form. In his early letters, he describes what he was like and who he then became. Prior to seeing Jesus, by his own testimony, Paul says he was a violent man. He persecuted the followers of Jesus. He went house to house. He plotted the demise of this early sect of believers. He put the Christians to death. But what does he become? He becomes radically changed. He teaches and persuades others that Jesus had risen from the dead and fulfills Old Testament prophecy. He is willing to go to extraordinary lengths of physical pain and suffering to preach the resurrection of Jesus. So much so he's prepared to go to jail, suffer beatings, right to the point of death. What else can explain this radical change in Paul's attitude and behaviour? By his own admission, it's that he has seen in bodily form the resurrected Jesus. Here are some of our common responses and objections to the resurrection. How substantial are these objections? Can they be refuted using the evidence for Jesus that we have? How likely is it that these objections are what actually took place? Here are some objections. Firstly, Jesus didn't exist historically. I suspect we've shown that this is highly unlikely given the evidence that we've already seen. Secondly, the accounts are just metaphorical. Well, Jesus doesn't appear to just be a metaphor. He is a historical figure. His life, death, resurrection, and post-resurrection experience shows us that. The resurrection is not just a metaphor. Thirdly, all of the accounts were made up at a later date. Well, we have early eyewitness accounts from the date of his claimed resurrection, and even the Jews indicate that the body from the tomb is missing. So from early on, the accounts were made and not made up at a later date. Fourthly, perhaps Jesus was never on the cross. I think this is highly unlikely given the evidence that we've already seen. Many witnessed his death and saw where his body lay. Fifthly, Jesus didn't really die. This is feasible, although I think highly unlikely given how experienced the Romans were at crucifying people as a means of death. They made sure people on the cross were dead. Sixthly, what about the claim that the women went to the wrong tomb? This may seem possible, though I suspect if your best friend had have died, you would go to see where they were laid. Seventh, what if someone took or moved the body? I mean, again, this is possible, and this is what the Jewish authorities argue for. However, if there was no body, or if the Jews had taken it or someone else had taken it, why wasn't the body just produced? You could have then put all of the followers of Jesus together and said, no, here's his body. I think it's highly unlikely that the body had been taken away. Eighthly, the resurrection occurrences are mass delusions. I think, again, this is highly unlikely given the number of people it is claimed Jesus appeared to on numerous different occasions. So what are the consequences of our inquiry? Over this series, we've considered the historical evidence for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. There were 5 broad considerations: Jesus' death by crucifixion, the burial of Jesus after his death, the historical claim to the empty tomb, the post-resurrection experiences, and the behaviour of the disciples, and Paul, a persecutor of Jesus. In light of all this evidence, the physical bodily resurrection of the man Jesus from the dead has the strongest explanatory power from the historical evidence that we have at hand. It is the most likely and best explanation, which means you can have strong confidence that these events occurred in history. And this is what sits at the core of the Christian faith. The evidence points to the resurrected Jesus, which means both as a believer or an unbeliever, you do not abandon the evidence to take a leap of faith. No, trust or faith or dependence has an object. In this case, the faith of the Christian is grounded in the historical reality that the person of Jesus has risen bodily from the dead. But to what end? Perhaps it just shows that he can come back from the dead. The Apostle Paul, in Acts chapter 17, is recorded as saying this about the resurrection of Jesus. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set a day when he is going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed. He has provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When those listening heard about the resurrection of the dead, some began to ridicule him, but others said, "We'd like to hear from you again on this." Then Paul left their presence. However, some men joined him and believed, including Dionysius the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. This is Luke's account of Paul's speech in Acts chapter 17. The Apostle Paul here indicates that the resurrection of Jesus confirms God's plan that people need to repent, that they need to turn back to him and live obediently before him. Why? Because of the rebellion that people carry out before God. God will call time on the world and bring people to account for how they've treated him and how they've treated others in their lives. Lest you think that this will not happen, Paul here indicates that the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus is given as a proof that Jesus is the one who will judge the world, which means how you respond to the resurrection and whether or not Jesus is Lord of your life matters deeply. Perhaps today is a good day for you to consider the claims and seek your response to Jesus.